At 24, Mirabel had seen more of life's hardships than most people twice her age. Born and raised in Sudan, she grew up in a home where the worth of a girl was measured by how well she could serve others, not by how much she could dream. Education was a privilege reserved for her brothers, and her father had been painfully clear. A girl's education is a waste of money. Yet Mirabel had always craved knowledge. The world beyond her small village felt infinite, full of possibilities, but all she could do was imagine. While others in her community accepted their fate, Mirabel's spirit refused to be contained. She secretly taught herself to read, piecing together books and newspapers, picking up fragments of English from traders and travelers. It wasn't enough, but it was something. When she turned 18, she made the most daring decision of her life. She left. With no real plan, no financial security, and no one to turn to, she ventured into the unknown, propelled only by her burning desire to carve out a future for herself. The journey was brutal. She faced hunger, betrayal, and moments of crushing doubt. But somehow, through sheer resilience, she found herself in South Korea, a country she had only known through the blurry screens of old mobile phones, watching Korean dramas on YouTube late at night. Mirabel had always been fascinated by the stories in those dramas. Grand mansions, powerful heirs, luxury that seemed impossible. She thought they were just exaggerated fairy tales, a distant fantasy meant to entertain, not something real. But stepping into the Kim estate, she realized that wealth, on a scale she could barely comprehend, wasn't just fiction. The Kim family's empire was beyond anything she had ever imagined. The estate alone was a world of its own, a sprawling palace with sleek glass walls that reflected the sky, endless corridors lined with artwork worth more than entire villages, chandeliers that dripped with crystal, and a garden so perfectly sculpted it felt unreal. To Mirabel, it wasn't just luxury, it was another planet entirely. She had seen poverty. She had lived it, breathed it, fought through it. But this was power, privilege, an existence untouched by struggle. It was like one family had gathered all the world's riches and locked them behind golden gates. Despite working in the estate for 2 years, Mirabel remained invisible. The housekeepers moved like shadows, trained to be silent, unnoticed, efficient. She had never once seen Lee Yun, the only son of the family, the heir to this vast empire. She had heard his name spoken in hushed, reverent tones. He was described as brilliant, cultured, disciplined, a man molded for greatness. But to Mirabel, he was just a ghost, a distant figure in a world she had no place in. In South Korea's world of elite power, Lee Yun was not just a name, it was a legacy, a promise, a future sculpted by the wealth of generations. As the only son of the Kim family empire, he was more than just an heir. He was the product of meticulous grooming, an individual whose every step had been mapped out long before he was even born. From childhood, he was taught that emotions were a weakness, that duty came before desire, and that the price of privilege was complete obedience. His mother, Madam Kim, had orchestrated his life with a precision that left no room for mistakes. His education was impeccable: Ivy League degrees, fluency in multiple languages, and a portfolio that made seasoned businessmen look like amateurs. His future was set. His business ventures would expand the family empire, his marriage would be to a carefully chosen heiress, and his life would be a reflection of power, prestige, and perfection. At least, that was the plan. Though Mirabel had never seen Lee Yun in person, she had heard the stories. The workers at the estate spoke of him in reverence. He's the perfect man. Women would die to be in his arms. His mother is already preparing his engagement with the minister's daughter. Have you seen his eyes? Cold, like he's always thinking 10 steps ahead. Mirabel only knew him from a single framed portrait hanging in the lavish sitting room of the mansion. A striking young man in a tailored suit, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes sharp yet distant. He exuded a presence of control, of someone untouchable, someone who belonged to a world far removed from hers. That was all she knew of him. But Li Yun had heard of her too, a whisper in the estate, a rumor among the staff, that amidst the many housekeepers who passed through his family's grand estate, there was one that was different, the only black girl. At first, it was just an interesting note, a small, insignificant detail in his otherwise perfectly organized life. But as time passed, he began to wonder why he had never actually seen her. It wasn't by accident. Mirabel was careful. She had spent 2 years ensuring that she never crossed paths with him. She had mastered the art of blending into the background, of staying out of sight, of moving in silence. When the family was around, she worked in places where they wouldn't go. When important guests arrived, she conveniently switched tasks with another worker. When footsteps echoed through the halls, she instinctively retreated. She had no desire to draw attention, because in this world of powerful people, being seen could be dangerous. In the grand hierarchy of the Kim family, where status dictated worth and wealth defined relationships, Mirabel was invisible. To the Kims, she was nothing more than a worker, an unnamed figure who moved quietly through their halls, ensuring that their world remained pristine and undisturbed. But there was one exception: grandmother Eun Kyung. At 78, Madame Eun Kyung Kim was a woman of quiet wisdom and sharp intuition. Unlike her son, who built the family empire, or her daughter-in-law, who thrived in social prestige, Eun Kyung valued the things that could not be bought: kindness, sincerity, and human connection. And she found all of that in Mirabel. For the past 2 years, Mirabel had carefully avoided drawing attention to herself, blending into the background as best as she could. But grandmother Eun Kyung had a way of seeing through shadows. It started subtly. The elderly woman took a quiet interest in her, not as a housekeeper, but as a person. She noticed how Mirabel carried herself, how she never spoke out of turn, how she was always respectful but never timid. She saw the intelligence in her eyes, the way she absorbed knowledge even when she wasn't given the opportunity to learn. She saw the hunger in Mirabel's soul, not for wealth, but for something more. And so, she called for her. At first, Mirabel had been hesitant. She wasn't sure why someone like grandmother Eun Kyung would want her around. The wealthy elders she had encountered before barely acknowledged workers like her. But Eun Kyung was different. She requested that Mirabel serve her tea instead of the other maids. She asked her to sit and talk while she ate. She started calling her by her name, not as a servant, but as a companion. And for the first time in a long time, Mirabel felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: comfort. No one in the Kim household knew Mirabel's story, why she was here, or what she had been through, except for grandmother Eun Kyung. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of the garden pavilion, Eun Kyung had asked her gently, "Tell me about your home, child." And for the first time, Mirabel spoke. She told her about Sudan, about the father who denied her an education, about the dream she had to chase alone, and about the pain and struggle that led her to this place. She expected pity, but instead, Eun Kyung looked at her with pride. "You are stronger than you know, Mirabel," she said softly. "Do not let this world convince you otherwise." From that day forward, Mirabel found herself gravitating toward the old woman. She loved the time she spent with her. They talked about everything: life, books, culture, even silly things. They laughed, something Mirabel rarely did in the mansion. In those moments, Mirabel was not a housekeeper. She was a person. And to grandmother Eun Kyung, she was a granddaughter in spirit, if not by blood. But this bond did not go unnoticed. The workers whispered about it. The other family members found it odd but brushed it off as the eccentricity of an old woman. And then there was Lee Yun. He had never paid attention to the workers in his home. He never needed to. Lee Yun had always viewed his family's estate as nothing more than a necessity, a place of luxury and power, yes, but also a gilded cage. Every inch of the grand mansion was designed for status, for presentation, for maintaining the perfection the Kim family was known for. It was a house where warmth was a foreign concept, where laughter was reserved for business dinners and carefully curated public appearances. But that day, something shifted. He had returned home earlier than usual, stepping into the quiet grandeur of the estate with his usual detached efficiency. He had no reason to linger. His life was built outside these walls, in boardrooms and corporate meetings, where he thrived under the pressure of his legacy. And then he heard it, laughter. Not the polite, carefully measured laughter of wealthy guests or the soft chuckles of business associates, but something real, light, unrestrained, and utterly free. His feet moved before he could stop himself. From across the courtyard, past the manicured gardens where his grandmother often sat, he saw her, a woman he had never noticed before. Not because she wasn't there. He had heard faint mentions of a black housekeeper among the staff, but he had never really seen her. And yet, here she was, sitting beside grandmother Yun Kyung, smiling in a way that lit up everything around her. Lee Yun stood there, watching. He had never seen his grandmother look like this, so unguarded, so genuinely happy. She was talking animatedly, her usual stern expression replaced by something almost playful. And Mirabel, the woman who was supposed to be invisible in his world, was sitting beside her, responding with the same ease, the same warmth. For the first time in his life, Lee Yun felt something stir in his chest, an unfamiliar pull, a quiet unraveling of the carefully constructed walls around him. It wasn't just her beauty, though, that was undeniable. It was her presence. She was different. She didn't move with the stiffness of those who lived in privilege. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, wasn't performing like the women his mother had carefully selected for him. She was simply there, existing in a way that felt real. And in his rigid, structured world, real was something he had never known. That night, Lee Yun couldn't stop thinking about her. For the first time in years, he felt restless. His perfectly orchestrated life suddenly felt suffocating, as if he were missing something essential. The next day, instead of returning to his usual routine, he found himself making excuses to come home earlier. Then again, and again. At first, it was subtle. He simply walked through the courtyard more often, pausing near his grandmother's garden, listening for laughter. He started taking meals at the estate instead of his penthouse in the city. When his mother questioned his sudden presence, he deflected, saying he wanted to spend more time with family. But the truth was, he wanted to see her again. And every time he did, the pull grew stronger. It started small. A simple exchange of words, a moment where their eyes met across the estate grounds. Then, he orchestrated moments to speak with her, brief at first, polite, professional. "You're close with my grandmother," he remarked one evening, stopping her as she prepared to leave the garden. Mirabel was tensed, her grip tightening around the tray in her hands. She had been careful for 2 years, so careful. And now, the one person she had hoped to avoid stood before her, watching her with an intensity that made her uneasy. "She likes my company," Mirabel replied, keeping her voice measured. Lee Yun studied her. "I can see that." And then, before she could excuse herself, he added, "She laughs more when you're around." Mirabel swallowed. She didn't know how to respond to that. She had spent her life being unseen. And yet, standing there under his gaze, she had never felt more seen. As the weeks passed, the interactions grew. Lee Yun found himself drawn to her conversations with his grandmother, fascinated by the way she spoke about life, about dreams, about struggles he had never experienced. Unlike the women he was surrounded by, heirs, socialites, business elites, Mirabel had lived. She was witty, intelligent, unfiltered in a way that was rare in his world, and he wanted more. But Mirabel was cautious. She had seen what happened to workers who forgot their place. She knew the power of the Kim family, how easily they could ruin a life with a single decision. She couldn't afford to be noticed by him. She couldn't afford to be wanted by him. She avoided unnecessary interactions, kept her responses short, always retreating when she felt his gaze lingered too long. But it didn't matter. Lee Yun noticed everything. He knew why she hesitated. He knew why she looked away, why she kept herself distant. And yet, he couldn't stop himself from wanting to break through the walls she had built around herself. Lee Yun was a man of control. His entire life had been built on discipline, precision, the ability to anticipate every move before it happened. But Mirabel was the one thing he had never accounted for, and it terrified him. Because in her presence, he wasn't the flawless heir anymore. He was just a man who had never truly felt anything until now. And the fact that his grandmother adored her, that only made it worse. Because if grandmother Yun Kyung, the wisest person he had ever known, had already seen the value in Mirabel, then maybe, just maybe, she was worth risking everything for. At first, Mirabel and Lee Yun's interactions were fleeting, brief moments stolen in the quiet spaces of the Kim estate. A polite exchange when he happened to cross paths with her, a lingering glance when she thought he wasn't looking, a conversation carefully disguised as mere curiosity. But curiosity became fascination. Fascination became understanding, and understanding became something neither of them were prepared for. They never spoke of it directly. There were no bold confessions, no dramatic declarations of love. It wasn't necessary. The way Lee Yun sought her out, the way his presence softened when he was near her, the way he listened, not just to respond, but to learn, spoke louder than any words ever could. And Mirabel, despite every warning in her head, despite the constant reminder that this man was dangerous to her stability, she felt herself lowering her defenses, one conversation at a time. Lee Yun had always been surrounded by intellect. His entire world was built on prestige, top universities, international business, and exclusive networks. He had been raised to believe that knowledge was power, that education was the defining factor of a person's worth. And yet, here was Mirabel, a woman who had been denied formal education, a woman who had to fight for every bit of knowledge she possessed. And she was the most brilliant person he had ever met. She had no college degrees, no elite credentials to boast of, yet she spoke with a depth that made him question everything he had taken for granted. "I envy you," she had admitted one evening when they found themselves alone in the library. Lee Yun frowned. "Why?" "Because you've had access to the world in ways I never could. You've had books, education, choices. If I had those things, I wonder, would I have been different?" Her words hit him harder than he expected. It was the first time in his life he truly saw his privilege, not as something to be taken lightly, not as something to be accepted without thought, but as a barrier that separated people like him from people like her. And so, he did the only thing that made sense. He started helping her. Lee Yun quietly began leaving books for Mirabel in the small study near the servant quarters. Philosophy, literature, history, everything she had ever longed to read, but had never been given the chance to. At first, she resisted. "I don't need your pity." But Lee Yun didn't offer pity. He offered opportunity. "You once said you wished you had more. I want to give you that, nothing more." And so, cautiously, she accepted. She devoured every book he gave her, and in return, she challenged him in ways no one else dared to. She questioned his world, his wealth, his purpose. She forced him to see beyond the carefully crafted bubble of elite society. "You have everything, but are you happy?" she asked him one night. And for the first time in his life, Lee Yun didn't have an answer. It wasn't long before Madam Kim noticed. She had spent years crafting the perfect future for her son. She had chosen his education, his business ventures, even the woman he was meant to marry, an equally powerful heiress who would strengthen their empire. And now, suddenly, Lee Yun was coming home more often. He was smiling more, distracted more, choosing to stay in conversations with a mere housekeeper. It was unacceptable. At first, her interference was subtle. She gave Mirabel more work, harder tasks, longer hours. She reminded the staff of their place, reinforcing the invisible walls that separated the workers from the family. But Lee Yun noticed, and it only made him more determined. Mirabel felt the pressure, too. She saw the way Madam Kim's watchful eyes followed her, the way the tension in the estate grew heavier each day. She knew what was coming, and she was terrified. This was not her world. She was not meant to be here. If she let this go too far, it would destroy everything she had worked for. So she tried to pull away. She distanced herself, avoided Lee Yun when she could, stopped taking the books, stopped lingering when their eyes met. But he wouldn't let her disappear. One night, after a long day, she found herself cornered in the empty corridor near the study. "You're avoiding me." She froze. His voice was low, careful, but there was something else beneath it, something raw. She didn't turn to face him. "I can't do this, Lee Yun." Silence stretched between them. Then he took a step closer. "Do what?" His voice was almost a whisper. "Talk to me? Be my friend? Let me care about you?" Her heart clenched. "Your mother will never allow this." Lee Yun exhaled slowly, as if accepting something he had already known. "I don't care what my mother allows." She turned to look at him then, really look at him, and what she saw in his eyes terrified her. This wasn't just fascination. This wasn't just rebellion. This was something deeper, something real. "Mirabel," he said, voice firm. "I don't want the life my mother planned for me. I want you." And with those words, everything changed. The air inside the Kim estate had always been heavy with expectation. It was a house built on power, on carefully constructed perfection, on rules that no one dared to challenge. But now, that world was unraveling. Because Lee Yun had fallen in love with someone he was never meant to love, and his mother was ready to destroy everything to keep him in line. It happened in the grand dining hall, where decisions about business empires and political alliances were made, where meals were served with quiet efficiency, and where no one spoke out of turn. This time, however, the meal was untouched. Madam Kim sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her expression as cold and precise as the crystal chandelier above them. Across from her, Lee Yun stood rigid, his jaw locked, his hands clenched at his sides. Between them, an unspoken war raged. She had known for weeks, had seen the way he looked at Mirabel, had noticed the way he lingered in places he never used to. She had witnessed her perfect son, her heir, falling into something dangerously real, and she would not allow it. "You have a choice to make, Yun." Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "A life with Mirabel will cost you everything, your inheritance, your position, your name." She leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. "I built this life for you. I chose the best for you, and you would throw it all away for a girl who has nothing to offer you." Lee Yun's fingers curled into a fist, but his voice was steady. "She has more to offer than you'll ever understand." His mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Then tell me, my son, is she worth losing everything for? A single question, a challenge, a threat. And Mirabel knew the answer before he even spoke, because she was listening. From just beyond the doorway, her heart pounded so hard she could hardly breathe. She had known this moment was coming, had tried to prepare herself for it, but nothing could have prepared her for the weight of it. She could not let him do this. She could not let him throw away the life he was meant to have. That night, as the mansion fell into silence, Mirabel made her decision. She had to leave and not look back. When Lee Yun returned home the next evening, he immediately sensed it. Something was wrong. There was a stillness in the air, a void that had never been there before. He moved through the halls faster than usual, ignoring the whispers of the staff, the uneasy glances that followed him. And then he saw it. Her room. Empty. No suitcases. No traces of her presence. Just gone. He turned sharply to one of the senior housekeepers, his voice harsher than he intended. Where is she? A pause, a hesitant bow. Miss Mirabel has resigned, sir? For the first time in his life, Lee Yun felt his world collapse beneath him. He had known she was afraid, had known she felt the weight of his family's power pressing down on her, but he had never imagined she would leave without a word. No note, no goodbye, nothing. She had vanished as if she had never been there at all. And that was when he knew. This wasn't just her decision. His mother had won. Or so she thought. For days, Lee Yun was a shadow of himself. He did not attend meetings. He ignored calls from investors, let business matters fall to the wayside. His mother, of course, noticed. "You'll get over it," she told him one morning over tea. This was a necessary lesson. You are Kim. She was nothing more than a distraction. Lee Yun set his cup down carefully. She is not nothing. His voice was dangerously quiet. His mother's lips twitched. You are not a fool, Yun. You know what is at stake. You were never going to marry her. You were never going to build a life with her. That was a fantasy. You're my son. You will do what you were raised to do. For years, he had done exactly that. Obeyed, followed, lived the life laid out for him. But now, he could no longer ignore the truth. Because without Mirabel, his life meant nothing. Lee Yun had spent his entire life playing the role expected of him. Now, for the first time, he would break the script. He went to his father first, not for permission, but out of respect. I am leaving the company. His father barely looked up from his paperwork. You're upset. This will pass. It won't. A pause, a sigh. Where will you go? Lee Yun's eyes were unwavering. To find her. He walked out of the estate that night with only the clothes on his back and a name that no longer held him captive. For the first time in his life, Lee Yun was free. And he would spend the rest of his life proving to Mirabel that she was worth everything. The day Lee Yun left his family, he didn't look back. Not once. Not when his mother called after him, her voice laced with anger and disbelief. Not when his father barely lifted his head from his business papers, as if dismissing him from existence. Not when the weight of 1,000 expectations tried to pull him back. Because nothing mattered more than Mirabel. And so he found her, in a small, rain-slicked alley on the outskirts of the city, in a cramped apartment where she had built a life out of nothing but sheer willpower. When she saw him standing at her door, disheveled, stripped of his title, his wealth, his carefully constructed future, she thought she was dreaming. But the reality was far more beautiful than any dream. I choose you, he said simply. I will always choose you. And with that, they began again. At first, life was hard. Lee Yun went from commanding boardrooms to working odd jobs just to make ends meet. He took positions beneath his qualifications, hands stained with labor he had never known before. And Mirabel? She pushed herself harder than ever, determined to prove that their love was not a mistake, that they could thrive without his family's wealth. They had each other, and for a while, that was enough. Until Mrs. Kim called. At first, they both thought it was a trick, another desperate attempt to control Lee Yun. But then, her voice, usually cold and calculated, softened. "Son, come home. Bring Mirabel with you." I was wrong. The words felt impossible. Lee Yun's heart soared. His mother, the woman who had spent years sculpting his future, was finally accepting Mirabel. She had finally seen the love they shared. But grandmother Eun Kyung wasn't so easily fooled. "Do not trust your mother." Lee Yun hesitated. "She has changed." Grandmother Eun Kyung's eyes darkened. "No, she hasn't. She's pretending. She doesn't accept Mirabel. She's luring you back. And once you're under her roof again, she will destroy everything." But Lee Yun wanted to believe in his mother's change of heart. And Mirabel? She only wanted to see him happy. So despite the warning, they returned. Mrs. Kim welcomed them with open arms, embracing Mirabel with the warmth of a mother. She lavished them with gifts, arranged an extravagant wedding, made a spectacle of their love. And for the first time in her life, Mirabel believed she belonged. But it was all a lie, because behind the veil of acceptance, Mrs. Kim was planning her son's downfall. She would not allow a girl with no education, no status, no pedigree to steal her son's future. And if Lee Yun refused to leave her, then she would make Mirabel leave him, no matter the cost. The night it happened, the air was thick with tension. Mirabel had returned home early, stepping into the grand estate she had once dreamed of escaping, and what she saw shattered her world. Lee Yun, sitting in the dim glow of the lounge, with a woman draped over him, his shirt unbuttoned, a half-empty glass of wine in his hand. The woman, an heiress, hand-picked by Mrs. Kim, pressed against him, her lips dangerously close to his. Mirabel's breath caught in her throat. Number? This couldn't be real. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped forward. "Lee Yun?" He turned, his eyes hazy, unfocused. "Mirabel?" The woman smirked, trailing a manicured hand down his chest. "Oh, darling, I think we've been caught." Mirabel felt the ground disappear beneath her. A setup? Or the truth? Lee Yun, her Lee Yun, looked guilty. And that was all it took. Her trust crumbled. "I trusted you." Her voice broke. "I gave up everything for you." Lee Yun surged to his feet, shaking off the woman beside him. "No, Mirabel, you don't understand. This isn't—" "Enough!" she snapped. Her vision blurred with unshed tears as she took a shaky step back. "I can't do this anymore." She turned, and this time, Lee Yun did not chase after her, because in that moment he didn't even know what to say. And Mrs. Kim? She had won. The divorce was swift, brutal, and merciless. Mrs. Kim ensured that Mirabel left with nothing. No settlement, no support, not even the remnants of the life she had built with Lee Yun. And so she vanished. She returned to the city, drowning in work, refusing to think about him, until everything changed. It started with nausea, then fatigue, then the realization. She was pregnant with Lee Yun's child. Her hands trembled as she held the test in her shaking grip, the weight of reality crashing down on her. How could she tell him? How could she bring this child into a world where his father was lost to her? And worse, what if this was exactly what Mrs. Kim had wanted? Because now, Mirabel was truly alone. The night Mirabel walked out of his life, Lee Yun lost himself. At first, he had tried to reason with himself. This was temporary. She was hurt. She needed space. She would come back, But days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and Mirabel never returned. He searched for her everywhere, every city, every neighborhood, every place he thought she might have gone. But Mirabel was always one step ahead. She had erased herself from his world so completely that it was as if she had never existed, and it destroyed him. Lee Yun buried himself in work. He built his own company, one separate from his family's empire, something he and Mirabel had once dreamed of doing together. He expanded, flourished, thrived on paper, but inside, he was drowning. His mother tried to control him again, presenting heiress after heiress, pushing him toward marriage. But he refused. "You took everything from me, Mother." His voice, cold. "You don't get to decide my life anymore." Since discovering her schemes, he stopped going to the estate altogether. He couldn't stand to be in the same room as her. And so, for 5 long years, he existed in a hollow, meaningless cycle. Work, sleep, work, repeat. But his heart never stopped searching for Mirabel. He had never stopped loving her. And when he was alone at night, in the silence of his penthouse overlooking the city, he whispered her name, Mirabel. "Where are you?" In a small city far from Seoul, Mirabel had built a life of her own. She worked hard, saved money, and created a safe, happy world for her daughter. Because yes, she had given birth to a baby girl, Ha-eun, a bright, beautiful child with her father's sharp eyes and her mother's warm smile. Mirabel had spent the past 5 years protecting her, loving her, giving her the childhood she never had. And though sometimes, in the quiet of the night, Mirabel thought of him, wondered if she had done the right thing by keeping Ha-eun from him, she always pushed the thought aside. "When the time is right," she told herself, "I will take her to see her father." But what she didn't know was that time was running out, because someone had already seen her. Back in Seoul, Grandmother Yoon Kyung stormed into Lee Yoon's office. He hadn't seen her in months, ever since he cut ties with the Kim estate. He looked up from his desk, surprised, confused, until he saw the look in her eyes. Urgency, hope, something he hadn't seen in years. "She's in Busan." The words hit him like a bullet. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. 5 years. 5 years of searching, of hoping, of hurting. His chest tightened, his vision blurred, and before he could stop himself, he broke down. He sobbed into his grandmother's hands, the weight of every sleepless night, every unanswered question, every aching moment without her crashing down all at once. "She's alive. She's okay. I can find her." But what he didn't know was that Mirabel hadn't just been hiding herself. She had been hiding his daughter. This time, he would not lose her. This time, nothing would keep him from her. Not his mother, not the past, not even Mirabel's own fears, because 5 years was long enough, and it was time for them to be a family again. Lee Yun didn't waste a second. From the moment his grandmother told him Mirabel was in Busan, his heart had only one mission: find her. The train ride was endless, each passing station stretching time unbearably. When he arrived, he didn't even stop to take in the city. He began searching immediately, retracing steps that weren't his own, chasing a ghost he had spent 5 years trying to bring back. But finding Mirabel was no easy task. She had always been good at hiding. 8 long days passed, days of endless searching, frustration, and near defeat. And then, just as he was beginning to think she had slipped away again, he found her. Her apartment sat in a quiet, beautiful neighborhood, the kind of place that felt safe and warm to live in. His hands trembled as he stood at her door, 5 years of longing pressing against his ribs like a weight too heavy to bear. And then, the door opened, Mirabel. His Mirabel. For a moment, the world stopped. The breath rushed out of him as he took her in. The same beautiful face, the same deep eyes that had haunted his dreams, but different, stronger, wiser. She stared at him, her expression frozen in shock, her lips slightly parted. "How did you find me?" The words never came out, because standing face to face with him, realizing that after all this time he had found her, Mirabel felt her heart crack open. Because the truth was, she had never stopped loving him, not for a second. With tears in his eyes, Li Yun's voice broke as he whispered, "How could you do this to me, Mirabel?" His words were filled with raw emotion, his eyes desperate, searching, pleading. "You left, and you never even looked back. Not once." Mirabel felt her throat tighten. If only he knew. If only he knew how many times she had turned back. How many times she had stood in the rain, debating whether to run back into his arms. How many nights she had cried herself to sleep, whispering his name, aching for him. But she had held her ground, refusing to break, because she had been convinced that leaving was the right thing to do, that she was protecting him. But now, standing here with him again, she wasn't so sure anymore. "What are you doing here, Li Yun?" The words escaped her lips, quiet, trembling. Li Yun didn't answer immediately. He was still trying to breathe, trying to make sense of the moment. She let him in, and suddenly they were alone together again, for the first time in 5 years. He looked around, taking in the small yet cozy apartment, a life built without him. "How have you been?" he asked softly. "Have you been living well?" Mirabel swallowed, her voice shaky. "I've been okay." It was a lie, and they both knew it, because neither of them had been okay, not without each other. Li Yun couldn't hold it in any longer. "It was my mother," he said suddenly, his voice heavy with grief. Mirabel turned sharply. "What?" "My mother set everything up. The night you left, the woman you saw with me, it was all a lie, a trick to make you walk away." His voice cracked. "She wanted us to fall apart. She wanted you gone." Mirabel staggered back, her head spinning. "No, it can't be." But deep inside, a part of her had always wondered. The timing had been too perfect, the pain too calculated. Li Yun took a step toward her, and before she could move, he wrapped his arms around her from behind. A back hug. The same way he had held her in their happiest moments. The warmth of his body against hers shattered whatever resolve she had left, and they both burst into tears, crying for the years lost, crying for the love they had been forced to let go, crying because this moment, this love, had never really died. And then, a small voice broke the silence. "Mummy, look at my new drawing." Mirabel's eyes widened, and then Li Yun froze. Time stopped. A little girl stood in the hallway, a drawing clutched in her small hands. She had Mirabel's soft features, but her eyes, those were his. A sharp, unsteady breath escaped him as he took a step back. His eyes locked on the little girl. "Mirabel?" His voice shook. "Who is she?" Mirabel's heart pounded violently. This was it. The moment she had dreaded for 5 years. She turned slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Li Yun, meet Ha-un." His breath caught. His chest ached so deeply he thought he might collapse. Ha-un. A name he had never known. A life he had never been a part of. And for the first time since he had arrived, Mirabel saw fear in Li Yun's eyes, because he didn't know if Ha-un was his, or if Mirabel had moved on with another man. And he didn't know if his heart could survive hearing the answer, The air in the small apartment felt unbearably heavy, thick with years of unsaid words, lost time, and the pain of choices that had led them to this very moment. Mirabel, trembling and with tears slipping down her face, took a shaky breath before whispering the words that would change everything. Ha-un is your daughter, Li-yun. For a second, it was as if time itself had stopped. Li-yun's world tilted, his vision blurred, his pulse thundered in his ears. His daughter? His eyes widened in shock, his chest tightening as he took an unconscious step back. His hands, which had been clenched into fists just moments ago, slowly loosened, now trembling with an emotion too big for him to contain. When were you going to tell me? His voice cracked, raw and filled with an anguish that he had never known before. Or were you planning to hide the truth from me forever? Mirabel squeezed her eyes shut, fresh tears spilling over. No, Li-yun, it wasn't like that. Then what was it? His voice was louder now, breaking, unraveling, thick with betrayal and heartbreak. No matter how angry you were, couldn't you have at least let me know that I have a daughter? That I had a reason to fight for more than just a memory of you? Did you? His breath hitched, his throat closing up. Did you hate me that much to keep our daughter away from me? His words hit Mirabel like a knife straight to the heart. Her lips trembled as she looked at him, searching his face, the man she loved, the man she dreamed of spending her life with. This wasn't how she wanted him to find out. This wasn't how she had wanted him to meet his daughter. But the truth had finally surfaced, and now there was no turning back. Mirabel wiped at her tears, her breath uneven. Li-yun, I didn't even know I was pregnant until weeks after the divorce. Li-yun's expression faltered, his lips parting slightly in stunned silence. Do you have any idea how challenging it was? She continued, her voice rising with every word, the weight of 5 years crashing down all at once. To go through the pregnancy alone, to give birth, knowing that you weren't there, to wake up every single night, scared out of my mind, wondering how I was going to raise her by myself. Li-yun staggered back, as if the impact of her words physically struck him. Mirabel let out a bitter, broken laugh, shaking her head. That wasn't the life I envisioned, you know. Li-yun lifted his gaze to her, his heart pounding. After our marriage, I looked forward to carrying your child. I dreamed about it. I imagined you by my side, holding my hand at every appointment, feeling her kick for the first time, talking about baby names at midnight. Her voice cracked, and the pain in her eyes shattered something deep inside him. But instead, I got something else. Instead of love, I got heartache. Instead of a future, I got abandonment. Instead of a husband, I got silence. Li-yun couldn't breathe, because she was right. She had endured all of it alone. Every appointment, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt and fear. She had done it without him. And somewhere along the way, their child had grown up without knowing the man who should have been there from the very start. He looked at Ha-un, still standing by the doorway, holding her small drawing in her hands, innocent, unaware of the storm raging in the room. And for the first time, Li-yun truly understood just how much he had lost. Tears streamed down Mirabel's face, and Li-yun did the only thing he could. He pulled her into his arms. His grip was firm, desperate, as if holding her could somehow take away the years of pain. I'm sorry, Mirabel. His voice was a whisper against her hair, trembling with emotion. I'm sorry for everything. For my mother's schemes. For the divorce. For the nights you had to cry alone. For going through the pregnancy and birth without me. His shoulders shook as he held her tighter, his own tears falling freely now. For having to do it all alone, Mirabel. I'm so sorry. Mirabel gripped his arms, her fingers digging into the fabric of his coat, her breath uneven as she finally let herself cry, for the love they lost, for the time they couldn't get back, for everything they had been robbed of. Then, a small, hesitant voice broke through the moment. "Mummy?" They both turned. Ha-eun stood there, her wide eyes locked on Lee Yun, confusion and curiosity mingling in her expression. Lee Yun's breath hitched. His chest tightened painfully as he looked at the little girl, the child he never knew he had. Her features were unmistakable. The delicate curve of her nose, Mirabel's, the sharp, intelligent glint in her eyes, his, a child who had never known her father, and a father who had spent years searching for something he never even knew he was missing. Tears blurred his vision as he slowly knelt to her level, his entire body trembling with overwhelming emotion. Ha-eun! Her name was foreign on his tongue, yet it felt like the most important word he had ever spoken. His hands trembled as he reached for her, but he hesitated, because for the first time in his life, Lee Yun was afraid. Afraid she wouldn't accept him. Afraid he was too late. Afraid he had already lost his chance. But then, Ha-eun tilted her head slightly, studying him. Her innocent voice broke the silence. "You're the man in the pictures." Lee Yun's heart stopped. "Mummy always shows me your pictures. She said you're my daddy." His entire body shuddered. Mirabel had never erased him from their daughter's life, even when he wasn't there, even when she had every reason to hate him. She had still told Ha-eun about him. The weight of it was too much. A choked sob escaped his throat as he reached out again, this time with more certainty. "Yes, baby. I'm your daddy." He didn't know what to expect. Would she turn away? Would she reject him? But then, Ha-eun moved forward and wrapped her tiny arms around his neck. Lee Yun completely broke. His sobs were uncontrollable as he held his daughter for the first time, pressing his face against her small shoulder. "I didn't know," he whispered over and over again. "I didn't know." Mirabel, watching the man she loved finally embrace the daughter he never knew he had, wiped away her own tears, because for the first time in 5 years, she saw something she thought was impossible: a second chance. That night, Lee Yun sat by the window, his heart swelling with emotions too vast to contain. His daughter, Ha-eun, lay curled up in his arms, breathing softly in the quiet of the room. The warmth of her tiny body against his chest anchored him in a way he never thought possible. He had missed 5 years. 5 years of first steps, first words, birthdays, laughter, and bedtime stories. 5 years of being absent from the life he should have been there to nurture. And yet, despite all that time lost, she accepted him. She called him Daddy. A silent tear slipped down his cheek as he pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. He would never let her go again. In the room next door, Mirabel slept like she hadn't in years. For 5 long years, she had carried everything alone: the weight of single motherhood, the fear of the unknown, the struggle of starting over, the exhaustion of endless work. She had built walls around her heart, shielding herself from the pain of their past. But now, for the first time in a long time, she felt safe, because Lee Yun was here, because she no longer had to carry the burden alone. The very next morning, Lee Yun wasted no time. He began making preparations to bring them home. Seoul was where he belonged. Seoul was where Mirabel and Ha-eun belonged too. He wasn't just giving them a house. He was giving them the home they had once dreamed of. For days, he worked tirelessly, ensuring that every detail was perfect. Ha-eun's room was one of a kind. She had never had a room of her own before, but now it was fit for a princess. Soft pastels in her favorite colors, a hand-carved bed, walls adorned with paintings of stars and galaxies because she loved the night sky, a library filled with books because she loved stories just like her mother, a small art station by the window because she loved to draw. Everything she had ever wanted was now hers. And for Mirabel, Lee Yun had prepared something even more special. The moment they arrived in Seoul, Mirabel's breath caught in her throat. Tears filled her eyes as she stepped out of the car, her hands trembling. She knew this house. She had dreamed of it. She had planned it with Lee Yun long ago, before the pain, before the separation, before the divorce. And yet, here it stood, exactly as she had imagined it. The perfect blend of modern elegance and warmth. A home filled with light, with love, with the echoes of a future they had once dared to hope for. She turned to Lee Yun, her voice breaking. You bought this house?" Lee Yun nodded, his eyes filled with nothing but love. "I got it 5 years ago." Mirabel's heart stopped. "Even after we divorced?" He let out a small, pained chuckle, his voice thick with emotion. "I never stopped believing that you'd come back." Her lips trembled as she stepped inside, and what she saw inside shattered her completely. Framed pictures of her hung on the walls. Her kind of clothes were in the wardrobe. Her favorite books were on the shelves. Even the kitchen was stocked with her favorite teas and spices. Everywhere she looked, pieces of herself were here. It was as if, even in her absence, Lee Yun had kept her close. As if, even when they were apart, he never let go. And suddenly, she understood. It had been just as hard for him as it had been for her. The 5 years had been just as painful for him as they had been for her. They had both suffered. They had both longed for what was lost. And they had both never stopped loving each other. A sob escaped her lips, and before she could crumble to the floor, Lee Yun was there. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight. "Mirabel," he whispered, his voice shaking, "I love you." Tears streamed down her face as she buried herself in his arms. "I love you too, Lee Yun." And now, with their daughter between them, they were finally a complete family. The following day, grandmother Eun Kyung arrived. The moment her eyes landed on Mirabel, they were filled with tears. "You're back!" Mirabel rushed into her arms, overwhelmed with emotion. "Halmione," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I missed you." The old woman smiled, brushing her hair back gently. "I knew you would return one day, my dear." Then, her gaze shifted, landing on the small girl hiding behind her mother's legs. Ha-eun peeked up shyly, clutching her mother's dress. Eun Kyung crouched down, her warm eyes softening. "And who is this little angel?" Mirabel swallowed, her voice thick with emotion. This is Ha-eun, my daughter." Eun Kyung gasped softly. And then, she opened her arms. "Come here, child." For a moment, Ha-eun hesitated, but then she stepped forward, allowing herself to be embraced. Eun Kyung held her close, tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered, "You have your father's eyes, but your mother's heart." It was the blessing Mirabel had always longed for. A family that welcomed her, a home that was finally hers. And as she stood there, surrounded by love, Mirabel knew this was where she belonged, with Lee Yun, with Ha-eun, with the family they had fought so hard to become. A love that endured despite everything. A love that was always meant to be. And this time, they would never let it go again. News traveled fast in Seoul's elite circles, and it wasn't long before Mr. and Mrs. Kim heard the shocking revelation. Mirabel was back, and with her, a grandchild they never knew existed. For the first time in years, regret weighed heavily on their chests, especially Mrs. Kim. The woman who had once orchestrated the cruelest betrayal now found herself standing at the edge of a truth she could no longer ignore. She had destroyed her son's marriage. She had manipulated, controlled, and forced him into a life of loneliness. And in the process, She had missed out on 5 years of her granddaughter's life. For the first time, she realized that she had not won at all. She had lost. Mrs. Kim tried everything to reach them. She called. She sent letters. She even went to Lee Yun's company, hoping to see him. But each time, he turned her away. He was determined to keep his family away from her. Mirabel, however, watched the turmoil in Lee Yun's heart. She knew he still carried the wounds of the past, but she also knew that holding on to hatred would not heal them. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace watching Ha-un play, she took his hand. "You should see them." Lee Yun tensed, shaking his head. "They don't deserve to see Ha-un, Mirabel. After what they did to us? After what my mother did to you?" Mirabel sighed, squeezing his fingers. "I know, but they're still your parents, Yun, and they're still Ha-un's grandparents." Lee Yun clenched his jaw, looking away. "What if they try to take her away?" Mirabel smiled softly. "They won't, because they don't have that power anymore." Lee Yun exhaled sharply. For years, he had carried the weight of resentment, anger, and betrayal. But now, with Mirabel by his side and Ha-un in his arms, he realized something. His mother no longer controlled his life. His decisions were his own, and this time he would be the one to set the terms. So after a long silence, he finally agreed. "Fine, but I won't let them hurt us again." The day Lee Yun's parents arrived, the air in the house was thick with tension. Mrs. Kim, who had once stood tall with pride and arrogance, now looked smaller, fragile, haunted by the weight of her past choices. Mr. Kim, always the silent businessman, looked uncomfortable, his gaze flickering to his son, unsure of what to say. And then their eyes landed on Ha-un. The little girl stood beside Mirabel, holding on to her mother's hand, her bright eyes filled with quiet curiosity. Mrs. Kim's breath hitched. She looked just like Lee Yun, her son's sharp eyes, his strong features. But there was something softer about her, something warmer. She was not just a Kim. She was her mother's daughter, too. And that realization shattered something inside her. Tears welled up in Mrs. Kim's eyes as she took a slow step forward, her hands trembling. She stopped, her voice cracking. For the first time in her life, she did not know how to speak. But Ha-un tilted her head and asked in a small, innocent voice, "Who are you?" Mrs. Kim broke. Tears spilled freely down her face as she covered her mouth with her hands, her body shaking. She had spent years orchestrating perfection. She had spent years controlling her son's life. And for what? To lose the chance of knowing her own granddaughter? I'm your grandmother," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. Mirabel, watching the woman who had once been her greatest enemy, felt an ache deep in her chest. This was not the same woman who had forced her out of Lee Yun's life. This was a mother drowning in her own regrets, a grandmother who had missed too much. And so, it was Ha-un who made the first move. She stepped forward, hesitated for only a moment, and then said, "You can sit next to me." Mrs. Kim sobbed. Mr. Kim, who had remained silent, exhaled heavily before nodding. He turned to his son. "Lee Yun," he said softly, I was wrong too." Lee Yun stared at them, his heart a storm of emotions. He had spent so long hating them, so long wanting to erase them from his life. But looking at his mother now, the once unshakable, powerful woman standing before him, broken, humbled, undone, he couldn't bring himself to hate her anymore. Mrs. Kim turned to Mirabel next, her gaze filled with guilt, sorrow, and something that had never been there before, humility. "Mirabel," she whispered. Mirabel held her breath, waiting. "I am so sorry." A pause. a moment too fragile to break. I was blinded by my own ambition. I thought I was protecting my son, but all I did was destroy him. And I hurt you. I hurt you in ways I can never take back. I can never undo what I did, but I want to try. If you'll let me. Silence. Then, Mirabel wiped at her own tears. She knew the pain of regret. She knew what it meant to be a mother. And she knew that forgiveness wasn't for Mrs. Kim. It was for herself. So with a slow, deep breath, she nodded. I accept your apology. Mrs. Kim collapsed into tears, but then Mirabel lifted her chin, her voice firm. But you will never control us again. Mrs. Kim stilled. We are a family, but this time it will be on our terms, not yours. Mrs. Kim looked at her son, her granddaughter, and the woman she had once tried to erase. And for the first time in her life, she truly understood. She nodded. I understand. The past could never be erased. The wounds would never fully disappear. But what mattered now was the present. And as the evening light filled the room, with Ha-Eun's laughter cutting through the tension, with Lee-Yun holding Mirabel's hand, and with the grandmother finally meeting the child she almost lost, they all knew this was a new beginning. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And this time, love would be stronger than the past. The end.